Good morning, everybody, and good morning, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining me once again. Most of my members know, the members in this group know that we come here and we invite people onto Facebook Live fairly regularly to give an opportunity for parent carers to know what's going on in Surrey, and a lot of that can be voluntary sector organisations, but sometimes we have officers from Surrey County Council. And Rachel, last August we invited you on as the Director for Children's Services, and you very kindly committed to coming on regularly. So here we are at the beginning of May, another springtime, and I think we're going to start by doing a little bit of an update on what's been going on from your perspective. Is that right?
That's right. So there are two things that I want to share with you today. So the first is a bit of an update on the data that I brought last time. You would have had that a bit earlier in the year if I hadn't got embroiled in an inspection in the kind of first quarter of the year, and I think that's why we weren't able to have our next meeting quite as early as we'd originally hoped. So I apologise for that, but I did commit last time to keeping on updating that information, and I will share that update. We'll probably whistle through it a bit faster than we did last time, because for many people who are listening, it won't be the first time they've seen it. It'll be updated information. So I'll do that. And then the other thing that I know that people are curious about is the so-called safety valve agreement. This is a financial and performance agreement that we've engaged in with the Department for Education, which is helping to manage the deficit in the high needs block funding, which is the funding for special education in Surrey and across the country. We have a long-standing problem with that, which is I know that people think that we don't spend enough, and the Department for Education thinks we spend altogether too much. And so we have arrived at an agreement with them about that, and people will be curious about what that means in practice for the work in Surrey. So I wanted to share a little bit about that as well. So
great.
Does that sound fair enough? And then obviously I know that you'll have some questions for me. So what I suggest I do is I share some slides about the updated data first, and then we pause and see if there are questions that you want to ask about that. And then I can hear a hound in the background.
Yes, I'm sorry, that's mine.
And then I'll come back with a second set of information about the safety valve agreement, and hopefully that will be helpful, and we'll see if we've got time for questions on those as well.
Great, that sounds good. So we asked parents, and I have a few questions. What I think I'll do, depending on how much time we've got, is if I can ask, if I can make sure that we get those questions answered afterwards. But certainly we talked about the importance of that update, that it's really important, I think, for parents to have visibility of that, so that it's transparent. And the theme that was coming up in the last few weeks is anything in, particularly in terms of finance in the special educational needs world, tends to make us as parents feel quite wobbly and uncertain. And so we had quite a lot of questions, which is why I'd asked you to give us a little bit of an explanation and a briefing on that. Sure. Lovely. I shall pass it over to you, and I shall make notes in case there are questions as you talk.
Okay, well, I will try and share my screen and hope the technology is kind. Yeah. So let me know if you can see.
Oh, that sounds good. I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a follow-up, as I say, to last time, and now it says I'm screen sharing, which I am. But so not all of the information is updated, because we haven't got fresh information in some cases, but there are a handful of slides which I'll take you to where we have got fresh information. So the first one is the requests to assess and decisions to issue, and this is updated data in relation to those slides. So we've got those education, health and care plans not agreed, and those not agreed which are resulting in tribunals. And so the latest information is there, and I think the picture probably hasn't changed very much, except for where the EHCPs not agreed have resulted in tribunals, and you can see the 2021 data kind of quite significantly different, I think, from earlier years there. So that's something that we're going to want to continue to keep an eye on, I think. Yep.
So, sorry, Rachel, can you just, I'm trying to see, so if we look at the decision to issue a plan,
Yep.
What does that 54% actually mean?
So that's referring to 74 actual children in the system, and so we have this is where we have refused to issue a plan, and this has ended up going to tribunal.
But that and that's not we don't know what the decision is yet.
So the tribunal kind of decision information comes later, but I suppose what we're noticing is only a small increase in the numbers of so if you look on the left hand side of us not agreeing, but quite a significant increase in those being contested. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
I hope that makes sense. And you know, that could mean one of two things. I suppose it could mean that although we're not refusing to issue a plan in significantly more cases, we are wrong to decide not to issue a plan in a higher proportion of those cases, but it depends on the outcome of the tribunal. And it may simply mean that people have an idea that they must go to tribunal about some of these things. And
it's really interesting, isn't it? Because I know we have these conversations a lot, and one of the things that we hear from parent carers is that they are being led towards tribunal, sometimes in a very direct way, where a case officer will say, well, I'll finalize the plans so that you can go to tribunal. So it's a conversation that we have on a regular basis, because there does seem to be some contradiction in how the system operates and how it would like to operate in those things.
We had a little bit of a challenge. It was not long after I arrived as a director, which was about a step that we had in place, which was a kind of more of a discussion to seek agreement ahead of the tribunal, and it was part of our process described online, and we were challenged about the lawfulness of that step because it was perceived as being a blocker to people's right to go to tribunal, and you know, the challenge was right, and we adjusted our guidance and our practice. But you could argue that that's a lost opportunity for an informal conversation, although the counter argument is families have rights to go to tribunal, and they need to understand what their rights are. What I think is interesting is that the green paper, the SEND green paper, which I wasn't particularly planning to talk about today, but which is obviously looming in the background, and we might want to talk about it next time. The green paper talks about compulsory mediation, which of course some people will regard as a really good idea of bringing us together outside a tribunal, you know, outside a tribunal environment, and much kind of lower pressure for families and for the local authority. And other people will regard it as an absolute kind of, you know, hoop to go through, or blocker in the way, or you know, and I think frustrating their rights. So
and I think a lot of that is also about how that mediation is done, isn't it, and whether it's actually effective.
Yeah, absolutely. So next thing to mention, so this has also been updated. It takes us from March 2021 through to 2022. So it's the kind of the year just ended. And this is the overturned refusals over time. So what you can see there is that the proportion of refusals over time, which have subsequently resulted in a plan being introduced in that same year, is shrinking. And what I haven't got in the left hand side of the slide is the actual numbers that represented that 63%, 76%, and now 80%. So I'm not in a position to tell you today what the actual number is in the past 2 years, but what it suggests is that we're more often finding a way to support young people without a plan where we've refused a request to assess. It doesn't mean necessarily that the child won't subsequently need a plan in a subsequent year, and I'm not suggesting that it does. But we'll keep monitoring that over time, because where you want to get to is not any absolute number of refusals, refused requests, but simply that where requests are refused, they're refused for reasons where everybody kind of feels comfortable that was the right decision at the time.
And what would be, I don't know if you collect this data, Rachel, but what would be really, it would be lovely to see of those children, of those families, how many of them are comfortable, and are the support arrangements that are being offered in place of a legal plan, are they appropriate, and are they actually being kept in place? And I think that's the thing that, one of the things that we hear so often from parents is one of the big reasons that they look to an EHCP is that, I suppose, that guarantee that the support identified will actually be put in place. Yeah. So this, I know that some parents are likely to look at this and go, well, this is really bad news for us. Okay. And I understand that if we get the SEND support arrangements right, then this makes sense. But it's a big if, isn't it? And it would be nice to find a way to understand whether those families actually feel reassured at the point of the decision. Yeah,
and I mean, some of the ways that that we map that are through things like, tribunal requests and the agreements that we come to over time, and occasionally feedback. So I had a lovely piece of feedback that was shared with me recently, which was somebody who was saying that they were really clear about the reasoning. They'd had a lovely conversation with the officer in question, absolutely equally clear that the door wasn't shut if circumstances changed in the future. And I could read from that exchange that they felt it was, spontaneous piece of feedback that was really positive. Now, I know that not all families have that experience. I had a conversation with a mum earlier this week, and it was really clear that over several years that hadn't been her experience in Surrey. My view is that we're working towards making that experience much more likely for everyone, but I'm acutely conscious that, for some people that won't feel real at all, and my inbox tells me that as well. So yeah, I agree with you, and I see your point.
Thank you.
I'm going to scoot, but do stop me if I'm going too far. So this one was just about on-time education, health and care plans, and that's because obviously timeliness is a feature as well. People don't want to be waiting for provision. I know that everyone is aware that it's quite challenging sometimes to draw all of the different inputs together to a plan, and not all of them are directly produced by the local authority. A lot of them are drawn in from other partners, and sometimes making sure that those are timely is a big kind of part of the challenge. So we haven't succeeded in getting a better timeliness than 65%. On-time EHCPs, January 22 is the latest date that we've got that for. You can see significant improvement since 2017, but it's creeping up rather than galloping up now, and that does reflect pressure in the system. But we will absolutely keep trying and keep working away at that. So we're not satisfied with 65% of plans on time. And the other thing that we're working on, and again, I know this is something that people express concern about, is where things are delayed, timely communication about the reason for the delay and how long people might expect to wait. So,
could I ask, Rachel, one of the things that you mentioned about the partners involved in drawing up the plan. Are you referring to getting the information from health partners, from other things? Because one of the questions that we come across every now and again is, do Surrey County Council outsource the writing of the plan to others, or is it all done within Surrey County Council?
To the best of my understanding, it's pulled together by the SEND case officers. I can't say hand on heart that we never use external third parties, because we do have staffing issues sometimes, and I wouldn't necessarily come to my attention if we do sometimes source plan writing from outside. But ordinarily speaking, it's the contributions, it's the reports that go into the plan that come from partners, and they're finalised in-house.
Great, that's really helpful. I thought it was worth clarifying that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I hope I haven't steered you wrong, but that's the best of my understanding. Slide 6 is also an updated slide, and this is the number of days taken for education, health and care plans issued. And this is a useful data, I think, to understand, because it partners with the slide that went ahead. And if we're not on time, one of the questions is, how far out of time are we? And what this shows is that, I mean, we had a really kind of high point earlier in this year, where we were really sorry, high point, I should describe it as a low point, I suppose.
Yes.
We peaked in terms of length of time taken to produce a plan in number of days. So these peaks and troughs are number of days, and our target is to get things done within 140 days. And then the average tells you how much longer typically a plan is taking. So that peak at the start of the new year was obviously very difficult for people who are waiting for plans, because the average number of days at that point was particularly long. But what you see kind of more clearly is us trying very hard to approach that 140 days, coming close to success, frankly, last year. And in the summer, which is often an interesting period in data terms, probably the closest to 140 days in August 2021, but climbing up slightly. But 151.1 days is the average, which is just a little over 2 working weeks late. So I'm not satisfied with that. I'm not saying that that's okay, but it does also kind of paint a picture of how late is late. Really.
It's really helpful, isn't it? Because if you are entering into this, and you will hear of some people who are waiting weeks and weeks and weeks, or months sometimes, or have done in the past. So to have an idea that on average you might be looking at an extra 2.5 weeks, it helps plan your waiting time, doesn't it?
Yeah. And again, I people who say we should get better at communicating if we're going to be untimely are absolutely right, and we will continue to work on that. The next slide is about tribunal appeals. This connects a little bit to what I was saying earlier, which is about kind of the numbers of refusals that we're making isn't particularly increasing, marginally, but not by much. But actually, the number of appeals does continue to appear to be going up, which is, I understand, is difficult for everybody. But you can see the green line on the screen is this year, 2022, and we're at a higher point this year than we were in any previous years. And you can see how the previous years ended, which is with each year a higher number than before. What I know people get really interested in is the outcomes of those appeals. We talked a bit in quite a lot of detail last time about what those mean. This slide hasn't changed since last time, nor this one. But this is a new slide since last time, and so is the next one. And I shared some of this information actually with an MP yesterday, so I'm sure that your members would be wanting to know and wanting to hear that we're spending quite a lot of time working with MPs to try and improve this as well. And the MPs are kind of advocating strongly on behalf of families and residents, as you'd expect them to, and we're trying to be candid both about what we're trying to do and about the difficulties in achieving some of that change. But these are, we had 538 appeals received between those two dates. 231 of those appeals are still ongoing, so obviously I don't know the outcome of those, but of those 307 where we've come to a conclusion, the vast majority were decided without needing to go in front of a judge. So that's another thing that I think is helpful to understand. And then some of them did end up in a full hearing with the judge for the decision to be made. That was 76 of them. And then for those that are heard or unheard, they're resolved in a range of different ways. So the unheard outcomes is kind of that space in which you can secure an agreement in a way that doesn't need to go all the way to tribunal. Some of these might have in the past been resolved before an appeal was ever initiated. But for the reasons I described earlier, families obviously have a right to access the tribunal, and needs to be, respected. People will have different views about, all of these outcomes and what that means. The ones in the unheard outcomes that I think to myself, well, how did we not resolve that sooner, are the 96 that weren't opposed by the local authority. Because I think to myself, goodness me, how have we ended up not in any way opposing this family, but they're still making an appeal? I don't quite understand. So those 96, and I don't have an answer to my own question yet, but those 96 are of real interest to me, because of course, if we could manage, because we're not opposing, if we could manage to get to that point before an appeal is issued, we might be back down to the sort of tribunal levels we were talking about 3 years ago.
And importantly, I think for those families, often those are the families who say, well, that was a complete waste of time. Why have Surrey put us through this unbelievable stress when we've been saying the same thing forever, and it's taken this step? And I think that would be really interesting, wouldn't it, to actually to deal with in the process. I suspect, one of the things that we hear a lot is a family talking to a caseworker. They are encouraged to go to tribunal, maybe because the caseworker doesn't know how to resolve, doesn't have the authority to make a decision or something like that. But there's that miscommunication. And as a parent, it's the last thing that you need, isn't it? So it would be really lovely to see that go down significantly.
Yeah, I agree. And so then in the heard outcomes, some are resolved through consent, some partially are held by the judge, some dismissed by the judge, which we would have called in the past found in favour of the local authority, and some are upheld by the judge, which of course is found in favour of families. And again, there's a kind of a question, I suppose, about those 43 which are upheld by the judge and found in favour of families, and people will say, well, why did you not concede that earlier? But my impression about those are they tend to be ones, not always, in fairness, but they tend to be ones where there are some kind of really important points that are contested. So I don't want to see us taking cases through to tribunal unnecessarily, but by the same token, there will always be some, because there will always be some really important kind of points of disagreement between us, and the whole reason tribunals exist is to enable that kind of really important judicial oversight of that decision making.
And do those decisions inform subsequent cases? So I'm wondering how much that there will be cases, I imagine, where you end up in tribunal because, as you say, it's a difficult decision. But what I would hope, I suppose, is that a similar case doesn't have to go to tribunal because the local authority has had some learning from that process.
Yeah, so I don't have complete line of sight of all of these. So quite a lot of tribunal decisions will happen without them being drawn to my attention. On the whole, where a tribunal makes a decision where we think, oh my goodness, we really didn't get it right here. The Director of Education draws those to my attention. Says, the tribunal has had this funding, and this is really significant for us. And the same actually is true if we have complaints that go to the local government ombudsman, and the ombudsman makes a decision where we think, oh, we've really we really need to rethink things. So I would say, without being able to kind of talk about all those 43, I would say that some of them contain learning where that is picked up, and it's really clear that that's taken forward in the service. In other cases, I think it's probably the case that it's not that there's nothing to learn. There's always something to learn from every time we are in a disagreement with a family, but because young people are different, because family circumstances are different, because what you can access readily in one bit of a county from another is different, and because we're bringing new provision on stream all the time, even if the circumstances appear to be very similar, we still might get to a different answer in future. So I try not to overread into one decision, a kind of an answer to all future questions. The last couple of slides that have changed are slide 15, which is about the amount of complaints we've got. So these you saw last time, but they haven't changed since last time because this is data that doesn't get updated very frequently. But this is a new slide about complaints. So the proportion of the population from whom complaints are received, and the absolute number of those complaints, and also things that are getting escalated to the second stage of the process. And again, people will have different worries or different views about what this data is telling us, but the one that I suppose I feel anxious about is the number of complaints that go to the second stage of the process, because I think we should be trying to resolve complaints at the first point of asking. So even though as a proportion of overall complaints that has come down this year, that's still 199 is quite a high number, and I would want to try and resolve that. You can see just outlined for you the most common themes, which we've touched on already, delays with the EHC process being a significant one, but two others that I haven't mentioned yet, transport provision. Yeah. And also children missing education provision, and that's been particularly tricky in the kind of pandemic and post-pandemic period. So some of the issues around attendance, persistent absence, emotional well-being, accessing a setting, staying on roll or moving off roll, all of those things tend to get kind of bundled into those. And in some cases I've seen correspondence where I think we haven't necessarily done the right thing, and in other times I see correspondence where I think, actually it's quite important for us to hold a line here for this child's well-being to be in a setting. So again, it's really a matter of trying to kind of match what's needed to a young person's needs. And then there are other less common themes and kind of very infrequent themes, but things that still sometimes emerge. So you've got a picture there, really. Yeah.
And I think what I find interesting is, I haven't seen this slide, which is important for members, that I'm seeing this at the same time as everybody else. Yeah. Those themes absolutely mirror what parents come to us about, and I suppose for me that I think it kind of validates a little bit the positions that we as Family Voice can take, particularly when we are taking challenge to various groups within the local authority, and I think it also it means that we can have conversations we are having the same conversation, aren't we? Which is really helpful. Can I ask, I had a question about complaints, and I just thought this might be the right time to ask it. Yeah. So we've heard parents saying to us the complaint system isn't working. Responses are often past deadlines and don't answer the question or resolve the problem. So parents come to us and say, well, our stage 1 complaint or stage 2 sometimes says, I'm sorry you feel this way, or I am sorry you had this experience, which doesn't actually feel like an apology, let alone a resolution. However, in spite of this, we as parents are often told by various parts of the system to put in a formal complaint rather than have a conversation to resolve things. What is Surrey doing to improve, particularly that bit where parents are pushed into the complaint system?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question, and I don't think I have a complete answer to it. So what our customer relations team would say is that they actively encourage the first line complaint response to be picking up the phone and having a conversation. So there does sound like a bit of a disconnect between those two positions. So I think it isn't necessarily a problem to submit a formal complaint, and in some cases it's hugely helpful to understand themes and some of this data that we're sharing kind of validates everyone's understanding of the trickier points in the system, but our internal process is that the customer relations team actively encourages picking up the phone. What I again don't have direct line of sight of is, of course, who does pick up the phone, how often that happens. And clearly that indication of what goes on to the second stage of the process suggests that we're not doing that often enough. So only a couple of weeks ago, the customer relations team came to my leadership team to talk with directors about how complaints are being responded to. There are some real staffing challenges, and that's my problem, that's not family's problem, and they're entitled to kind of expect people to get back to them promptly. But I do know that caseworkers are absolutely flat out, and sometimes it is really difficult because they're bouncing from one thing to another to create time for the kind of call that would maybe resolve things. But also, the counter argument to that is that sometimes, a 45-minute conversation could resolve sort of weeks of toing and froing by email. Yeah. So we're going to continue to try and support and encourage people to pick up the phone. But I am treading carefully about that, because I don't want to lose more people who feel under more pressure than they can deal with in these roles. So I mean, I'm very happy for us to kind of keep coming back round that question each time we sit down and talk. I mean, the other thing that I see, so obviously some complaints do come via my inbox. Some complaints go directly into the customer relations team. Ultimately, the people providing the answers and the responses to those complaints will be from the practitioners who are working with the families and their direct line managers, because they're the people who have the casework understanding. But stuff that passes through my inbox, if an answer is going to come back in my name from me, obviously I get a draft, with the information, and I get a draft response. My reflection is that sometimes those draft responses, I feel that I would find them provocative if I received them, and so if they pass through my hands, I amend them. So the basic facts don't change, but the style of the letter.
I think you raise a good point, and I mean, as a parent, hearing you as the leader of this team say that is really reassuring. And then on the back of that, my parent question goes, so what can you do to make sure that the tone of those letters improves? And it's about that bit, isn't it? There's something very distressing and, as you say, provocative about the formality of some of these responses.
And that is really tricky, because obviously I don't have line of sight over all of those, and people's responses would be even much more delayed, and if everything had to pass through my hands. So again, I'm not suggesting that I'm the only person who knows how to write a really good letter either. There are obviously other people within the system who are able to provide the facts, but also with some really reflective language. And for all I know, some people get letters from me and they don't think I've managed it well either. So again, we're trying to make sure that complaint responses are supported by managers, in some cases by more senior managers who have got an eye on both the tone and the content. And I know that you know this because we were together last week, but I'm recruiting some additional support into the service, and there will also be responsibility for that individual to try and kind of have a stronger grip on that process, in a sense, to kind of bring my sensibility about what is and isn't appropriate to kind of include in a letter to a process where I can't possibly be inside it all the time. So yeah, so we're looking to resource that a little bit differently, and I guess future conversations will tell me whether we've been successful or not there.
Great.
I will just flag, so the final slide that has been updated since last time is just around caseload, and again I know that caseload, staffing, this is our problem to solve, and certainly not families, but just a little bit of a reflection on the caseloads that are being carried in the service. So the SEN case officer with the smallest average caseloads are there in the southwest at the moment, but they do have more than 160, and in the northwest it's over 200. And that reflects both case numbers and staffing. So it is tricky.
Yeah.
Those were all of the updated slides. So I stopped sharing my screen at this point. Were there any other questions about the data? I'm conscious that time is flying and people want to hear about the safety valve as well, don't they? So
I suppose not specifically. We have questions about what kinds of new schools Surrey is planning to bring on, and I suppose it's all around that managing the process, isn't it? So one of the big questions that we have is that many parents have been told that educational psychologists are now only doing statutory assessments and no reassessments, which some children desperately need. You know, we talk about staffing, but this kind of thing has been going on for a really long time, and the question is how do we manage that?
Yeah, it is a real struggle. So I saw you know that was a kind of that was a question that was featured, and that kind of, you know, it can't be staffing because it's been going on for so long, and I have real sympathy with that perspective, but it is true that education psychology is a shortage occupation, and that we continue to struggle to have enough education psychologists to have the capacity to do more than the statutory work. So the reason for the limitation on it is not because we wouldn't want to do non-statutory work or we don't think that that would be beneficial. It's simply, if you've got limited resources, you must do the statutory work, and therefore you know, there may not be capacity to do other things. We haven't got a straightforward answer to that, because it is about recruitment, retention, capacity in the service, and funding the service. So we are short on education psychologists. We're short on SEN case officers. Some of our health partners are short in some of the other occupations that contribute to EHC plans. On the social work side, I'm down numbers of social workers. And it's really curious because we are, if you look around you, as I'm sure you do, you know, petrol stations are short of petrol pump attendants, and transport services are short of bus drivers, and you kind of, you wonder where everybody is, because, you know, retail and hospitality, everyone is crying out for workers. So we do have a number of shortage occupations across the service, and I can't, at this stage, I know it would be desirable for education psychologists to be doing more, but I can't at this stage commit to them doing more until we find a way to kind of raise the numbers, and we haven't found that
one
yet.
Of the things I wonder if we could maybe address, probably systemically, is I've heard from a number of parents recently where you have an annual review, and it might not be an EHCP review, it might be a review because they're in the SEN support, and the child has absolutely not met any of their outcomes and they're really low. And a number of parents came to me and said, well, the outcomes were set by the educational psychologist. Some of those parents have managed to obtain, some by tribunal, a review. And one of the ones that really struck me was a parent came to me and said the ed psych, who was a Surrey ed psych, told her she was acutely embarrassed by the outcomes that she had set in the first assessment, that there was no way that child would ever have achieved them. And I think that it speaks, doesn't it, the limited amount of time educational psychologists are able to spend with the child. And then the schools are holding that child and the system and the family almost to account for reaching those outcomes. And the conversation at that review stage becomes one where the school says, well, we clearly can't meet need, or we can't do this. And you get into this adversarial discussion where, you know, is there a system by which potentially, my head is going into strange directions, but do we need an educational psychologist specifically all the time to review those outcomes? For a lot of children, yes, but given the staffing issues that you are mentioning, I wonder how that shortage is impacting the relationship between schools, professionals and children and the families. And then you get that, well, we need an EHCP because we need that thing. It feels like a rolling problem with a lot of consequences.
Yeah, I think that's a really sensible observation. And I think it's one of the problems with the arrangements as currently described, which is the kind of the way that we set about creating education, health and care plans and developing the content and thinking about how they drive provision. And some of that is reflected in the, again, in the green paper, in the SEND review, just the understanding that although the Children and Families Act was kind of really well intentioned and was supposed to be positive, it hasn't achieved what it set out to achieve, and therefore it needs to be considered differently. So I think there's an opportunity for us in the response to the green paper to try and think creatively about how we, by which I mean the entire system, work better with each other and work better with families. But we will probably have to codify whatever the next iteration is of that in any white paper and legislation that follows, because otherwise if we depart from what we're supposed to be doing, then of course we're in real difficulties. And yeah. So that's, I mean, that's quite a sort of live piece of consideration right now, is how the SEND green paper along with the education white paper kind of work together to increase inclusion and just make a school environment better for young people, and just kind of more realistic and more responsive to their needs, but without a great big kind of paraphernalia of you know, professionals attached to it. But we've got to get that balance right, and that is that is very much a national conversation. So not a straight answer, but it's a, you know, you're absolutely right, and it's a live issue.
It'd be really interesting to see kind of moving forward, I suppose, those issues around recruitment and how nationally are we addressing it by, I suppose, promoting those professions in terms of our education settings. And I spoke to a wonderful young person with additional needs themselves, actually, a few months ago, who is at university doing psychology and is being traumatized on a daily basis because of the language that the psychologist, the course, uses with regards to autism.
Oh, that's interesting.
There are very,
and disappointing.
Yes, very disappointing, very outdated views about autism. That as a psychology student who is autistic, she's having to absorb, she's having to regurgitate to some extent, and all that because she wants to help children like her.
Yeah.
And actually, those are exactly the kind of ed psychs that we want in the SEND world, aren't they? So I think I'd like nationally to see a conversation about you know, how we improve that and how we make that profession more inviting and appealing. And I think one of the issues has to be that most of the people I meet want to work with children, and a lot of their work seems to be bureaucratic. So when they get into it, how do you keep hold of them?
Yeah.
Rachel, I'm very aware of the time, so I wonder whether it might be a good time to have a bit of a chat about the safety valve agreement. Is it helpful maybe for me to kind of, I had a question around that from a parent that might give us the context that the parents. So this parent, I will read out because they're not my words. How is this money going to help Surrey adhere to education law and provide the correct provision for children and young people with SEND? How will it affect the EHCP process and continual delay tactics? And how will this so-called safety valve agreement reduce the massive pressure and feeling of abandonment felt by children, young people and their families in Surrey? So it is an emotive topic.
Yeah, it is. I suppose the candid answer is that isn't what the safety valve agreement is setting out to do, which isn't to say that it won't have an impact on those things. So I understand why families feel that we are delaying, blocking, getting in the way. I don't I don't think we're doing that on purpose. I accept that it sometimes feels like that. I accept that it sometimes has that impact. That's certainly not the instruction, the kind of leadership direction that comes from me. We are, and the Department for Education would say that we are doing more, spending more, agreeing more than we should. And so one of the reasons why things have been challenging is because the funding for this is it's central government funding. It's not, or it shouldn't be, local government funding, and it has been less for several years now than we would argue meets the needs of our children. But central government hasn't been agreeing with that, and part of their challenge back to us has been you're quite an outlier, Surrey. You have more children on plans. They have different needs from your kind of benchmarking other authorities, and so they are pressing us to. Sorry, I've just had an offer for a cup of tea in the background.
Excellent.
So nice, isn't it?
Yes.
They are pressing us to be really attentive to what the law requires, and not to steer children out of mainstream into specialist provision when their needs could be met in mainstream, and so on and so forth. So but in trying to respond as promptly and as effectively as we can do to Surrey's children's needs, and I accept that families don't feel that that's what we are doing, but at our end, that is what we're trying to do. We've ended up spending significant local government money in this area, effectively creating a deficit. And so the safety valve agreement in its kind of purest sense is rectifying that deficit. So central government saying, okay, you have spent some of your own money when we should have been funding this. We'll put that right, but also with strings attached. So with significant oversight of how we're responding to children's needs and families' applications, either requests to assess or for a plan. So what this does is it kind of rectifies the balance sheet. It has a kind of close look at what we're doing in our transformation programme around services for children with additional needs. And because they're going to monitor us very closely, it's really tight DFE oversight, effectively, of our practice as well as our financial management. So what that doesn't do is necessarily mean that families always secure the outcome that they want, but what it does mean is that they secure the outcome that the DFE says they should have in this context, and we do so, through mechanisms that the Department for Education has approved and agreed is right. So they look at our transformation programme, and they, for example, some of the things that we're kind of very deliberately setting out to do, identify needs earlier. So what our kind of early years provision looks like, to create more inclusive practice in our mainstream schools. So some of our mainstream schools really, have this terrific. Others know that they've got more work to do. We've got an inclusion round table, which has engaged a lot more Surrey schools in a really positive way. So more mainstream, step down arrangements as well as step up, a reduction in the use of non-maintained independent provision, because we're building more school places in Surrey. So all of those things are things that the government is saying, yes, you should be doing in order to better meet children's needs. And so that's the combined oversight is of practice and of finance. Does that help explain it?
I hope so, yes. Can I ask, I think one of the real fears is both at that central government level and certainly in Surrey, we've been hearing for a long time that Surrey is an outlier in the number of plans and we need to reduce the number of plans. Is there in that agreement a part which I suppose says to Surrey you can only have a quota of EHCPs per year? No, there isn't a numbers cap on
children receiving support.
Right.
I mean, apart from anything else, that wouldn't be compliant with that wouldn't be compliant with the law.
Clearly.
What there is, though, what there is scrutiny about the decision making around that. So what has been done is that there's been a forecast of what we're likely to spend, given what we know of the number of young people in Surrey, given what we know about the kind of prevalence of different kinds of additional needs in our child population, given what we know about the specialist places that we currently have and the additional places that are coming on stream, which says this is the trajectory that we would expect to be spending over the coming 5 years. If we start to deviate from that trajectory, which could happen for a lot of reasons. It could happen because more children have plans, but it could just happen because their needs are more complex and it's more expensive to meet. If we start to deviate from that trajectory, which is what the Department for Education will be looking at, they will be interested in why we're deviating. So there absolutely isn't a cap on numbers. There isn't a kind of, you may not use this kind of placement or you may not offer this kind of provision. And in fact, I think they're expecting us to be kind of creative about the sort of arrangements that we put in place for young people. But they will be looking closely at, so that question of kind of, why are you an outlier and what is it that you're doing will be part of what they're seeking to answer.
I think that's a really helpful answer. I think one of the things that I would say here is I had another conversation recently with a school in Surrey. It was a primary school where they and parents were telling parents that they couldn't apply or request an EHC needs assessment because they'd already requested 1 or 2 that year already. And my question was, well, no, that's not how it works. It's about the individual child. But I think across the system at that ground level, there are some misunderstandings. And there seems, certainly some schools that we hear from are clearly feeling a pressure brought by, what they understand as the local authority to not request plans. And I wonder whether we systemically need a more subtle conversation about what we're talking about. And I imagine a lot of it is to do with, actually we're talking with case officers, everybody is working flat out. Do those practitioners have the time to really properly understand when we are talking about more inclusive practice? That doesn't mean that the child in front of them that needs more specialist support shouldn't be getting it.
So what schools might hear certainly is if a request has been made more than once and circumstances there's no new information and circumstances haven't changed, they might very well say, we're not going back to Surrey again. We've gone twice and we know what the answer is. So I can imagine that happening. And again, that's not because there's a quota. It's not you can't, but it will be, I'm sure it will be the case that people will understand that some things are kind of futile and therefore shouldn't happen. There is some proposals in the green paper, which is around the kind of professional, and actually in the education white paper, proposals around professional development for SENCOs in schools, which I think are really kind of strong, very much kind of the foundation of inclusive practice. One of the bits of response that I will send on the green paper when we submit our response is that I think that there should be some nationally endorsed professional development for case officers in local authorities. I think they have a kind of an extraordinary role because they're at the interface between families, schools, and other professionals. They don't have a particular professional discipline themselves. They're not psychologists and they're not GPs and they're not speech and language therapists, etc. But they have to draw together all of those, in some cases, competing points of view and produce something which is meaningful for families and helps direct provision. And I don't think that there's a national framework yet that really addresses the kind of skill set that's needed. So to kind of like get to the core of your question, which is everyone who's doing these roles, do they really have kind of the skill? And the subtext to that is also capacity when you look at those caseloads to kind of really see the child in front of them. I'm not sure that they do. I'm not sure the system as it's currently constructed kind of allows for that. But clearly you get much better kind of more child-centered provision the more that you can have a child at the center of your thinking.
Yeah, thank you. That I think the main question that I haven't been able to ask yet, but it kind of follows on. I think everybody agrees, something that we hear a lot is we feel that SENCOs need training and we feel that case officers need training. At even a more granular, what's the day-to-day doing of things level, many of our children, their main adult that works with them is a teaching assistant. They are the least qualified teachers in a school, and yet they're tasked with supporting the most complex children, which often seems like a contradiction. So the question that I had was, what plans are in place to improve the skills of teaching assistants who provide invaluable support to our SEND children and often have the most contact with them? And I wondered, does Surrey have a plan for upskilling them, for supporting them, for keeping them in place so that they don't change every 2 minutes?
Not one that I have been made aware of.
Okay.
For the whole of Surrey's teaching assistant population. Sometimes that doesn't mean it's not there, because there's quite a lot that goes on in my directorate that doesn't kind of come directly through my hands. But it may well be that there isn't a Surrey level plan, because these are employees of individual schools, and the professional development of their staff within that framework is largely the responsibility of those schools. Now, of course, what Surrey does do is we do have professional development offers for employed staff in Surrey schools. And what I don't know, but I will take away the question, is whether we have an offer that schools can access, which is for teaching assistants. So long gone are the days when kind of the staff in maintained schools were all kind of formally they are employees of the local authority, but they're very much the business of schools themselves, and their professional development is a kind of planned there. But we do have programs that professional staff can access, so I can check and find out whether our TAs are included in that.
I think that would be, it feels like a very important part of things we have. And, we hear so often of outstanding work done by a TA, and the work of, often it's an individual, isn't it, that actually allows that child to be successfully in a mainstream environment. And then you go into the next year, and for whatever reason, that TA doesn't follow them and everything falls apart. So there's something around the TA population, the TA training, that there's a need, I think, for it to be consistent. So it would be really good to understand better. I suppose it's understanding the TA role from a local authority perspective, and what role can the local authority play to make sure that in the SEND world those TAs are given the training and the support that they need.
Yeah, I mean, across all roles, really, there are limits to the local authorities' ability to kind of insist. I mean, very, very deliberately, and of course the education white paper makes it even more clear, there's a separation between local authorities and schools, even maintained schools. So the kind of the old days of local education authorities are long gone. Increasingly, any services that are provided through connected but arm's length bodies. So we have the Schools Alliance for Excellence in Surrey, which is a really important schools-led collaborative working with schools, and increasingly outside the kind of statutory core provision that local authorities are required, we trade services. And so a lot of the answer to those questions about professional development is, do we have an offer that schools want to buy into, or do they buy into other sources? Increasingly, as we see academisation kind of roll further and more schools being within multi-academy trusts, the question is to the multi-academy trust, what is your understanding of the role of TAs, and how do you engage them in their professional development. So it's a tricky landscape. It's a bit of a patchwork. I understand that, and it can be frustrating sometimes from within the local authority as well. But I think we have to be careful not to overreach.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Right.
So the only other question that I had was around the special schools that are kind of planned. We are working at Family Voice, we're working on this issue as well internally, but I suppose, do you have a quick answer? We are asked specifically, there seems to be, well, there is a lack of provision, of specialist provision for children who are academically able but can't manage in mainstream. And I know we talk about a more long-term plan, thinking of if we could make mainstream schools more truly inclusive, then that population would shrink. However, it's clear that there's always going to be a small number of children who fall into that category. Does Surrey have any plans for specialist provision for them?
So what we're trying to do is to look at where we see children in numbers leaving maintained provision into the non-maintained independent sector, and to forecast what the likely numbers of those are, to see whether we can commission additional provision. So that what leads us in our school place development is what those numbers of kind of unmet needs in the state sector are. And we're following those. So we keep looking at that, keep bringing new places online, keep making those available to our child population, and then obviously looking again to see what further expansion we need. So that those aren't the first places that we're looking at, but we will keep being in that iteration of looking at, you know, actual new schools, but also additionally resource provision in existing schools around some of those additional needs. And it really does depend on what the profile says of the numbers of young people, if they reach critical mass, which suggests that separate kind of school provision would be sensible. That's what will take us there.
In all of that data looking, do you include those children who are on education other than at school packages or alternative provision?
Good question. I'm not clear. So
I'll let you go and have a look at that at some point when you've got, you know, free time. Those are the ones that we hear from a lot in this particular category, where no school placement either in the maintained or non-maintained sector have been found. And often the ones that we hear from, and we ran a survey on this earlier in the year that we're working with Surrey Youth Focus to analyse, but there were well over 300 responses. And the issue often is that families or the system is unable to find a school that can meet the educational ability, the academic ability of those children. And then you're looking at quite bespoke and quite isolating solutions a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So it's, as I say, we're also working on this with various officers, but it's been such a big question that it felt important to raise it.
I mean, we do know which children have EOTAS packages. We are trying to follow the data. What I'm less clear about is when you break those numbers down, how clear it is that within that group there is a clear kind of provision type that we could create. And so that's the bit that I'm unsure about, but I will take back.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really aware that we've gone over our time, Rachel, and I'm very grateful for the amount of time that you've given me. And I haven't had any comments as we've been going, so I will keep an eye on that when that happens. I say thank you, and I welcome the next one.
And we'll try and get back onto a kind of quarterly footing.
That sounds great.
Forward. So
super.
I look forward to it.
Thank you very much, and I will say bye-bye to everybody.